Football, especially Welsh football, is very important in my life. It began at a really young age, kicking a ball out the back garden every chance I could, and even breaking the traditional mould by wearing a Cymru football kit to school for St David's Day. I was forced to retire from playing in 2015 through injury, but my life still revolves heavily around the beautiful game. In my work today, I look at the younger generation who are used to seeing the men's team qualify for major tournaments and expect to see big crowds in big stadiums for the women's games. This unfortunately wasn't the case for me, and I often wonder about what it was like for the generation before me and the generations before them. It made me want to know more about how we got here and the origins of football in Wales. If I was born 100 years ago, would my life still have revolved around Welsh football? To learn more about the origins of the game in Wales, I met with Professor Martin Johns, a historian who specialises in the history of Welsh football.
North East Wales is the cradle of football, not just in Wales, but it's one of the earliest places in the world where the game develops. And part of that is down to public schools, private schools. And in the middle of the 19th century, those schools really start promoting ball games, football, as a way of teaching these kids to play as a team, to be a team, to obey rules. And these are kids who are going to go on to be the leaders of the British Empire. The schools wanted them to be disciplined, to be team players, not to be selfish. And football is seen as a way of developing all of those things. But there are a lot of different ways of playing football. In some schools, the emphasis was on dribbling the ball. In some schools, the emphasis is on running with the ball. And the dribbling version of the rules evolves into what we call football, or soccer, as they called it then. The running version evolves into rugby. And that all relates to what's happening in Wales, because the nearest public school to North East Wales is Shrewsbury School. And they played a version of the game where people dribbled. And the version of football played at Shrewsbury School is why it's football rather than rugby that takes off in North East Wales. Druids is one of the very early clubs, and the name Druids kind of captures what's happening in the 19th century. The sense of Welshness is like, this is an ancient nation. And there's a really strong determination to show that Wales is different to England, that it's not just a region, that it's a country in its own self. Wrexham is formed in this era when the game is really just getting going, and Wrexham, I'd argue, are the second oldest professional club in the world, and they date their history back to this really early period when the rules are still evolving, when people are kind of experimenting with different ways of playing.
Wales had undergone massive change in the 19th century because of the Industrial Revolution. So what we find by the end of the period then is the country's just been transformed in particular parts. So South Wales in particular. By the turn of the 20th century then, you have large urban areas, rows and rows of terraced housing, and you've had a huge influx of population as well, from across the globe, but particularly from England and Ireland.
Socially, how would that have looked like then for both men and women?
So one of the key changes that takes place in the 19th century is the gendering of the workforce. So as a consequence for working class women who lived in areas like the coalfield, their lives became quite centred around the home, particularly after marriage. And for men then, there's an emphasis on them earning a wage to be able to keep their family.
In those kind of communities, those industrial communities where there's money around, but there's also kind of a tough life, you want a release. Yeah. And that might be drink, that might be religion, but it could also be sport. So there's a population that's growing, that has money, that is very male in some ways, and it's hungry for entertainment. And people who have moved into this coalfield from England have their existing sporting tastes. And if they were moving in from places like Lancashire, or the north of England, they bring with them a taste for football.
This is really for men, is bringing them together. They would have had far less women who would go in to be spectators at these games.
Yeah.
In part, this is because it's such a male atmosphere and there's quite a male culture around it. But also we need to think about what free time that women had as well. They had like less opportunities for leisure.
Just before the First World War, the population of South Wales is growing, small clubs are being set up, and these clubs start to become ambitious. You know, they're getting in the gates, people are watching them, and they want to kind of make their mark. And, you know, playing your local rivals is one thing, but just over the border there are these big clubs. And there's a glamour attached to them. And the big English clubs start getting invited down to South Wales to play exhibition games. And people turn up in their thousands and thousands to watch this. And that gives people in South Wales some faith that actually, if we set up a professional club, then actually we can make money out of this. It's going to be self-sufficient.
Despite rugby having the head start in South Wales, professional football grew rapidly in the early 20th century. Martin explained the complex politics that led to big Welsh clubs playing in the English leagues. In 1912, there were two prominent leagues in England, the Football League and the Southern League. The success of the Football League began to leave the Southern League behind. Their solution was to tap into football's popularity in South Wales. They promised the likes of Swansea Town and Mid Rhondda guaranteed entry into the Southern League if they formed professional clubs. Cardiff City had already formed 2 years earlier, but the prospect of top-level football made them turn professional. This was the start of football as the modern industry we know today. But only 3 years later, it was faced with a major existential crisis.
When war breaks out, rugby says, boys go off and fight the greater game in France. And all rugby games are immediately suspended. Football is a business. Players have got contracts. Football says, well, the war probably won't last that long. If you want to go, of course you can go. We'll release you from your contract. But if you want to carry on playing, you carry on playing. So for one season, football carries on during the First World War. And it gets so much criticism. If you open any newspaper, not just in Wales, but anywhere in Britain, in kind of basically autumn 1914, the war is just starting, there are letters in the press saying, it is disgraceful. There are people watching games at Ninian Park while their brothers are dying on the fields of France. And football is a disgrace to the country. Football's reputation is completely tarnished by the war. Everything is just more difficult, so the logistics of it are really difficult. The crowds, although they are still there, they're not at the level they were before the First World War, because a lot of men, the core audience for football, have gone off to fight. The football, for financial reasons, for reputational reasons, for pragmatic reasons, in 1915 says, that's it. They carry on playing friendlies, it's not like the game completely disappears, but the organised professional game comes to an end in 1915.
So initially there's a rush to enlist for young men to go and do their bit for the war effort. Now for women we can see an enormous change. Now women had always worked before marriage, but what the war brings is an opportunity to earn a decent wage. And there's also an opportunity for women to move out of the family home as well before marriage. So there's a big movement of the female population around the country as they take up opportunities to work. One of the biggest employers then is the munitions factories. Although we need to be careful in seeing this as just opportunities for women, because male management and also the trade unions tried to make sure the women didn't become too skilled, that they could replace male labour. They're given tasks and so on that were sometimes quite menial, just to make sure that when the men returned, they weren't replacing them. And also because trade unions lobbied that women shouldn't earn the same as men, because this would affect men's wages when they returned from the war. So some progress, but you've got to remember this is, not necessarily a huge opportunity.
Stephanie told me it was common for the women who worked in munitions factories to play football as a means of keeping fit and boosting morale. I met with John Carrier, a leading researcher on the history of Welsh women's football, to find out about one particular woman who had a massive impact on the women's game in Wales. Now, Anne Griffiths-Jones is a huge name in the history of women's football. What more can you tell us about her?
Anne Griffiths-Jones, you could probably write and make a film about that particular lady. She wasn't Welsh, although she came from a Welsh family.
And has got a very Welsh name.
Yeah, she was born in Hemel Hempstead in 1891, and her father was a leading barrister, and he moved over to Swansea with the family. You could tell she was a tenacious character because she became a suffragette, and at the age of 22 she became the secretary of the Suffragette Society in Swansea. And then obviously the war broke out and she ended up at the factory called Baldwin's, and she was responsible along with the manager from there, and they formed a women's team. It was originally called Baldwin's United, and that was in 1916. And Anne, what she did was she persuaded a gentleman in the factory, Bill Evans, who was a former Swansea footballer, and whether he would coach the girls in the rules of football and teach them the finer points, which he did. All the games that they played were charitable games to raise funds for prisoners of war funds, for hospitals. The games were very much like an occasion, an event, more than just a competitive football game. The factory then became Swansea National Shell Factory, so it was Swansea NSF, and she even formed a team called the Nondescripts and played the Swansea girls and beat them, and I believe she scored. She played for Wales, she even played for Cardiff ladies. They raised thousands of pounds across Wales for various charities.
I was struck by Anne's story and how familiar it felt. Not only did I also play for Cardiff City Ladies in Cymru, but she reminds me of the women who coached me and continued to break down barriers which ensured opportunities for females in the area. So you've got a fair few photos here and some books, and this is a team sheet from...
This one was kindly loaned by Gail Newsham, who is the writer of In a League of Their Own, which is the book about the history of the Dick Kerr's ladies. And basically it shows the two teams, England and Wales. England was AKA Dick Kerr's ladies. But what was interesting was the Welsh team, if you notice, they're all from different clubs.
Yeah.
There's Cardiff, there's Swansea, there's Newport again, Bargoed, Baldwin's.
Yeah, you mentioned them.
And there, Anne Griffiths-Jones, Baldwin's, centre half.
Is this the actual formation? Because it looks very attacking.
I would say that was probably the formation. Yeah. They adopted some very strange formations.
Five up front, goals galore. That's the way we want to play the game, not defensively.
Carrying on with Anne Griffiths-Jones, there she is from the team Baldwin's. This is actually a blown up image of a postcard that was actually in Jean Williams' book, A Game for Rough Girls. And it tells you in there, Baldwin's United, but it says it was circa 1920. Right. I actually believe this was probably 1916. Yeah. 1916, 1917. And there, right in the middle with the ball on her lap, is Anne Griffiths-Jones.
In 1918, Anne formed the first women's football league in South Wales. It was an ambitious but well-organised operation. However, the league only lasted 3 months. The war had ended and the men were coming home.
Just after the First World War, there's this brief economic boom. There's money around, there's employment around, people are hungry for entertainment, and football really benefits from that. The attendances rapidly go up at small clubs like Mid Rhondda, at the big clubs like Cardiff City. Mid Rhondda for like big games like local derbies are getting 20,000 people sometimes. For Cardiff City's big games in the Football League, they're sometimes getting 50,000 people. So football has really arrived, and rugby's really worried about this. In the Football League at this time, there's something called the maximum wage. Basically, clubs were not allowed to pay players more than a certain amount. And this is to stop the richest clubs getting all the best players.
They should bring that back now, I think.
There's a lot of sense for it in some ways. But players felt it was really unfair because there's 20,000 people watching them, but they're only being paid a few quid a week. But that rule didn't apply in the Southern League. And what that means is that small clubs like Mid Rhondda, Llanelli were doing it as well. They're looking for Football League players and basically saying, we can pay you more than you would be earning in the Football League. And they start getting really, really good players. Llanelli signed the Scottish captain.
Wow.
At this time. By then, Cardiff City have thought, we're too big for the Southern League. And they applied to join the Football League.
Okay.
They join the Football League. The Football League works out that they need to kind of put down the Southern League. So actually what they end up doing is saying to all the First Division Southern League teams, come and be part of the Football League. And Division 1 of the Southern League becomes Division 3 of the Football League. So suddenly the biggest clubs in Wales, or in South Wales, suddenly are part of the Football League. So they're playing bigger clubs in England, and it's got this glamour because then there's a route to the First Division, there's a route to the FA Cup. But it doesn't last. In 1921, the coal industry runs into really significant problems. There's a strike, and there's basically the beginning of almost a 20-year depression in the coal industry. And football is a business. You know, if people are on the dole or on strike, they can't afford to go to the pub, they can't afford to go to the football. You know, you spend your money on your priorities, your food, your family. And suddenly, these big clubs like Mid Rhondda, their attendances just collapse almost overnight.
At this time, South Wales was seeing some of the highest unemployment figures in the world. And in 1921, Mid Rhondda was suspended by the FAW after the club was affected by the wider industrial decline. Meanwhile, in Swansea, the congregation of two chapels in Cymru wrote to the mayor complaining, "We strongly object against the degradation that has taken place recently in our town in allowing females to play football at the park." Now, in 1922, the FAW implemented their ban on women playing on affiliated grounds, but there was no reason given in the FAW's minutes of the meeting. What do you think were the reasons behind this then, or do you know any more?
Well, when I first saw about the ban from the minutes, I've read them myself, which was the 3rd of March 1922. And if I may, I'll read you what the ban actually said. It said, "Ladies football. The council decided in the interests of the game, they cannot allow matches to take place between ladies teams on Welsh grounds." That was it, full stop. So it was a bit wishy-washy. It wasn't really forceful because back in December, 5th of December, I think it was, in 1921, the English FA had come in with a much sterner wording on their ban. So in some respects, the Welsh had been a bit
on the fence,
a bit undecided of which way to go with this.
I think we can see the ban then as part of a kind of wider culture, the suppressing women's rights in this period. So you have the right to vote is granted. But beyond that, we can see, you know, through the government at all levels, you know, Westminster, but also local government. And also this kind of, there's this wider culture and atmosphere of trying to get things back to normal. And what's often meant by that is trying to reassert male authority within society. So we could see the ban then as part of that. You know, the football pitch is a male space where men play, and women shouldn't be kind of encroaching in that way. And it also would have been seen as unfeminine for women to be running around and sweating in that way, you know, doing a sport that was quite, you know, well, it was like very physical sport and so on. So women's place was to stand on the sideline, not to be running around in that way.
29th of August 1939, they reworded the ban. And I'll read you the rewording because it's quite interesting. It states, "No football match in which any lady or ladies take part in any way whatsoever shall be permitted to be played on any football ground within the jurisdiction of this association. Clubs, officials, players or referees are not permitted to associate themselves in any way whatsoever with ladies' football matches." That particular ban became known as Rule 34. And many of the women who I've interviewed over the years have quoted to me that particular ruling, because that prevented them from expanding the game.
The ban on women's football would remain until 1970. The men's game didn't take long to rebuild and thrive, with the likes of Cardiff City establishing themselves amongst the elite clubs. They came close to winning the First Division in 1924 and won the FA Cup in 1927. This final was reported as Wales v England and carried more national significance than the international team at the time. In 1923, Anne Griffiths-Jones moved to Singapore and formed a school. During the Second World War, after refusing to return to Britain, she was held as a prisoner of war. After the war, Anne returned to Singapore, opening 2 schools, one of which is still open today. Anne was awarded an OBE for her services to education, but her contribution to football is still unrecognised. I've really enjoyed learning the story of how football took root in Wales, but it has also left me quite frustrated. Growing up, the players I looked up to were all men. When I made it to the elite level, I was coached and played alongside some of the trailblazers in Welsh women's football. However, learning about players like Anne Griffiths-Jones and the munitions teams have made me realise that there are hundreds of untold stories from women across the century. Women who didn't have the opportunity to play professionally in front of sold-out stadiums in big games that are broadcast all over the world. I wonder if Anne felt in 1918 as I do now. This is just the beginning.